mother was saying or anything like that. Obviously,
Well, obviously, the most important aspect is to, if you're retained prior to this individual being charged. I mean, as much as the listening public's not going to want to hear it, you're not going to allow your client to make any statements to law enforcement anymore. She has an absolute Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and it's not a point of saying that you're trying to hide anything from the authorities. What you want to say is, listen, we'll talk to you potentially, but my attorney, my doctors, and everyone's going to be present who's there to make sure that I'm protected, because as much as people, again, I know I mentioned it earlier, people out there who are listening, and they don't realize what happens when people are in police custody. They don't realize how things can be, that are being written down on a piece of paper. They're not writing down facial expressions, or they're not writing down hand gestures. Things are absolutely 100% taken out of context when they're not recorded, which I guess leads me to a completely different tangent of this is why I believe that all police interrogations, whether minimal misdemeanors or anything, should always be recorded with audio or video equipment. I mean, we're in the 21st century with phones and high definition cameras, and everything should be equipped that way. So nothing is lost in translation. So what she says to her attorneys, what she says to her doctors are very important here, which is why if she hasn't been charged with this, and I believe as the press of those articles, she had not been charged with this child's death. So if she has an attorney, I'm sure those are going to be some of the things that they have to think about.
And Alex, let me put you in that same situation. What would you do?
The first thing you do, assuming you come into a case, is you want to, as Bob was right, you can't let your client speak to the police under any circumstances, or at least under very limited circumstances. But you want to look at all the evidence that comes your way, and you want to sit and evaluate it, and then you want to determine what is the best possible defense that is available to you at the present time. The best possible defense here may be a mental health defense. And if that's the case, you would want to retain the services of psychiatrists to examine her, look at her history. Has she been in hospitals? Has she been on medication? Is she taking drugs? Or is there some other event that occurred in her life which could have caused her to act impulsively? And if you obtain all this information, then at that point you take that information and you first go to the prosecutor. And you say, look, Ms. Prosecutor or Mr. Prosecutor, this person has serious mental health problems. Let's resolve this case now. We don't need to go to trial on this case. It's very clear she has a mental health problem. Let's work out a disposition. Let her plead guilty to a low-level manslaughter case. Do a certain amount of time. She'll get out and hopefully get treatment. And we want you to take that disposition because that is most likely what's going to happen if we go to trial. So don't waste everybody's time. Don't waste resources. Let's work out a disposition right now. So that's most likely going to be the avenue that this case is going to take.
And Joseph Scott, what's your take on this as a forensic expert?
Yeah, the biggest piece of evidence that they're going to have is going to be the child's body. First, at autopsy, they're going to do an assessment to determine if, in fact, the child was alive or dead when the child went into the water. One of the keys here that they're going to be looking for is to see if the child has any debris in the child's mouth, and not just in the mouth, but down into the airway specifically. These creeks and streams in South Carolina right now are really flooded. There's a lot of tiny debris that's floating around. If the child did inhalate anything, it will be down the airway. This is not just something you would find in the mouth. Secondly, the lungs at autopsy will be effused with fluid, and there's a weight that we look for in the autopsy room that's a standard weight relative to good, healthy lungs. If the child did, in fact, drown, the lungs will be much heavier than normal. Now, to another point, it will be very interesting to see if the child was harmed or traumatized in any way, possibly prior to going into the water. If the child did go into the water deceased, it'll be interesting to see if there's marks around or to the head that would indicate that the child sustained these injuries prior to going into water, that maybe the water was just there to facilitate the hiding of the body, if you will, with hopes that the body would be swept away. So the evidence that will be generated in this case, obviously there's not going to be a lot of trace evidence like we would have in a dry case. The evidence that will be generated in this case will come from the autopsy. And also, I'd be very interested in the care of the child. That's something that we can determine at autopsy to see if the child was malnourished, if the child was well cared for during life. So all of this is going to come into play as this case begins to develop further.
Hey, Joe, let me ask you one question here.
Yeah.
Let me just ask Joe, if a dead child, a deceased child, is put in a creek, now we're talking about a fast-moving creek, maybe there's rocks around, can't water and the debris be forced into the child's lungs just because of the fast-moving currents?
You'll have a pooling effect that takes place, but for the water to get down into like the alveoli of the lungs themselves, no, you're not going to have this infusion that would normally take place with a child that would be inhalating it. There will be a distinct difference. Like I said, it's not beyond the pale to have debris that'll set in like little twigs and leaves and this sort of thing, but they're not going to make it a long, long way down the airway at that point.
Wow.
Okay. We have some callers. Let's go out to New York City and let's say hello to Scott, who joins us on King Jordan Radio on a Thursday night. Hi, Scott, and welcome to King Jordan Radio.
Well, hey, good evening to you all. Thank you for a very informative and in-depth show. It's refreshing to find a show that where everyone has time to talk and it's not interrupted by commercials, and especially with things as serious as these crimes. You know, I think it deserves that kind of solemn, uninterrupted, serious attention. So I thank you, King Jordan, for providing a platform for that.
Thank you.
I just had a question, Mr. Sanchez, about said earlier about the 11-year-old boy who was shot and his 16-year-old brother who's still in critical condition. You said that one of the strange things about the case was that no neighbors say they heard anything, or heard any shots. And I was wondering what the panel makes of that. I mean, do you think the neighbors, do you think this is an example of, as you were talking earlier, about neighbors not talking up for fear of retribution? Or do you think it's possible that the neighbors are being honest and they really didn't hear shots?
I find it incredible in a small community where the houses are pretty close together that somebody can go into somebody's house and they're shooting. There was probably some screaming by at least one of the kids, you know, when he's either being shot or the other kid when he came upon the scene, that nobody could have heard this. Nobody saw anybody walking into the apartment. Nobody saw them leave. Nobody saw somebody jump into a car or run down the street. There's people out there, as Bob said before. There's people coming back from sporting events. There's people coming back from church events. There's people coming back from dinner, right? There's people walking the streets. How could it be that nobody has any information? More likely than not, there is somebody that heard this or did see it, and they're frightened. Now, let's hope that those people are, in fact, providing information to the police, but the police are not revealing this because they're trying to protect the person who's providing this information. But if it turns out that nobody's coming forward and nobody's providing information and they're doing so intentionally, you know, that's a very sad commentary on American culture, that people are now either so fearful of providing information to the police because of retaliation or because they just don't want to get involved. And I just hope that if there are witnesses it's time to come forward and capture this person, because today it was this 11-year-old kid and his 16-year-old brother. Tomorrow it's you. The time to act is now.
Okay, anything else, Scott?
Yeah, I was just wondering if what the other panelists thought also as well of the fact that no neighbors have come forward. Is it all basically your consensus that this is about fear of retribution, or do you think that the neighbors are being honest here, that they truly didn't hear anything?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are, we're going to be the first people to say that people are lying. But I think when you've had as much experience as we've had, both, again, I was a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, there's always, if someone's running from, gunshots are very distinct things. To hear them, to see them for yourself, even to go to a firing range, you hear it once, you're going to know what that shot is, and what that sound is. So the fact that, as Alex said, houses that are close together, quiet neighborhoods, people who are outside, there's just, in my opinion, no way that someone didn't see something, someone didn't hear something. You're immediately drawn to something like that. You're looking for where it came from, the direction it came from. And then what do you think do you think they just drove off quietly and slowly, like it was a normal, they were out for a Sunday drive? I'm sure, were speeding down the street. Someone who could have been on a bike, someone who was walking their dog, again, taking their garbage out, who was sitting out on their front porch smoking a cigarette. Something happened here. Someone saw something. And it's just a matter of time until the police department finds out what that information is. And a lot of times, unfortunately, and as we said it earlier, the street code is you don't talk, you don't snitch, even if you know what happens out of fear of retribution. The two times, because one, they'll say the street, we'll exercise street justice, which just is going to revolve in another homicide or another shooting or another violent act, or the times in which people actually do come forward, unfortunately, are when they get arrested. Oh, I know who killed that 11-year-old boy, and here's how I know. And then the prosecutor and the police department are forced to cooperate and give a plea deal to potentially a violent criminal, a violent person, or a drug dealer, or someone who's, in custody, and has to cut them a deal to potentially prevent them from getting jail time just so they can make an arrest on this case. So, obviously the system works a whole heck of a lot better when people cooperate, but these are the things every single day that police officers, prosecutors, and defense attorneys deal with when dealing with these high-profile cases.
Thank you.
Thanks for the call. Let's go out to Virginia and say hello to Mary Wainwright. Good evening, Mary. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine, King Jordan. Thank you for your show. And I want to say hello to everyone on the panel. And
hi, Mary. Hello.
Mr. Shalk, nice to meet you.
Oh, thank you.
Love the show because lay people like us can call in and, ask questions. And some of us that are sort of intrigued by the crimes that happen in on Facebook, I have my own group, trials group, so I follow all this stuff, and I have 1,000 members. We're all interested in what is happening and why are things happening like that. And Alex, as far as the grayish color to the baby, I do know a little bit about that. All babies have a grayish coating when they're born or just born. It's called a vermix. It protects the skin. And once the baby is washed up and stimulated and the baby takes his first breath, then the oxygenated blood circulates, and then you start getting the pink appearance to the baby. If you get a blue appearance, it might be that the blood is not circulating properly. It could be a circulatory problem, or it could be a pulmonary problem, that there's not enough oxygen. But as far as that woman saying the baby's gray, whether that means he was dead or not, that would not, it doesn't mean anything. I just wanted to tell you that.
Thank you so much for that. And Joe, I hope you're paying attention to this lady, because she sounds like she knows what she's talking about.
Joe had it right.
I'm going to have to hire you as an expert.
Okay. So what I'm calling about, and we are all concerned about, that it's just the most heinous crimes of all are the crimes against children. And to me, the worst that I can find is the ones that are committed by parents or a mother or a boyfriend or someone